Hello, my name's Eric Kisch. I was born in Vienna in September 1937, and I escaped Vienna with my parents to Shanghai in February of 1940, lived in Shanghai until 1946, came with my parents to Melbourne at the end of 1946, and went to school and university here until 1960 when I went to America to study and have been living there ever since. About 10 years ago, my cousin Alice Peer, who lives very near to the Holocaust Center, asked me to give a talk about our family's experiences in Shanghai. And in preparation for this, I looked at materials that I had gathered from my mother and my father after their death. I put together what is known as a PowerPoint presentation, and this was originally entitled Validating Family Memories. My recollection of Shanghai and of what happened there was that of a small child, and what I gathered over my years as a teenager here in Australia, listening to my parents and their friends talk, was basically interesting stories. My career was in marketing research, and as a researcher, I was very interested in validating. And so this talk developed into what documents and photographs do I have that basically are the evidence for what I learned in my childhood. So the talk is called Refugees in Shanghai, the Story of the Kisch Family in 1939 through 1946. What I'd like to do before I present you with our documents is give you a brief video introduction from a superb documentary called Port of Last Resort. So here is about a 4-minute clip that I think introduces the subject of Shanghai to you.
We had relatives in the United States. They were willing to provide us with an affidavit, which they filed with the State Department, that we would not become a public burden. That was not good enough. There was a quota. And my quota number, I think, was 67,000. And we were told it might take about 1.5 years before our quota comes up. I wouldn't wait that long. I wanted to get out the worst way, and I said, if we don't find a place to go, I go over the border. So we looked for an alternate solution. Everybody asked me, why was it so difficult to leave Germany? It was not. It was a free world that would not give us a place.
Somebody came up in the summer of 1938 with the idea there's one place on earth where you can go without any paper, no permit, no affidavit, no special entry permits, not visa. You just get there, that's Shanghai.
It would take about 4 weeks to get there, but the boats are all full. There's a waiting list, 6 to 12 months. The travel agent said to my mother, I know you have some impressionistic paintings. The agent of the German steamship agency is a collector, hinting. He got a couple of our paintings, and a few weeks later came a call from the travel agent. A Jewish couple on board the Potsdam, the German liner, committed suicide on board the boat as it left the harbor of Hamburg, and a cabin for 2 would be available. So it was decided that my mother and I go ahead. We are only allowed to take with us 2 suitcases each and 10 marks, the equivalent of $8 American. One of the worst moments was when I said goodbye to my father and to my sister. I knew in my heart I would never see him again. We entered from the mouth of the Yangtze. We got into the Wangpu River. the muddy Wangpu. And as we finally came closer to Shanghai, we were getting very nervous because on the right side we saw nothing but ruins. Nothing but ruins. The whole coastal area were ruins. We found out later on, since 1937, when the Japanese invaded China, there was severe fighting between the Japanese and the Chinese forces. The Japanese controlled the harbor, and later on we were puzzled that it was the Japanese that actually permitted us entry.
Declaration from the Japanese Five Ministers Conference, December 6, 1938. Our diplomatic ties with Germany and Italy require that we avoid embracing the Jewish people, but we should not reject them as they do, because of our declared policy of racial equality. This is particularly true in light of our need for foreign capital and our desire not to alienate America.
Notice from the National Christian Council of China, February 1939. The persecuted Jews of Europe are pouring into Shanghai. 40 arrived on the Lloyd Triestino steamer in July, another 40 in August, then 80 in September, and now each steamer brings them by the hundreds. At first, it was the professional men who came, doctors mostly, who, by a stroke of the pen, were forbidden to practice their professions. Now, it is the white-collar workers, grocers, cafe keepers, tailors, barbers, and young women who were secretaries or corset makers or shop workers. Most of them speak neither Chinese nor English. They land in Shanghai, a blind alley.
Now, why Shanghai? One of the biggest problems that Jews in Germany and Austria and other parts of Europe had in getting out was not the difficulty of leaving, it was the difficulty of entry. You needed an entry visa to get there, and many of the so-called Western democracies had closed their doors, basically speaking, to Jews. The only place left, apart from a couple of obscure cities in South America, was the city of Shanghai in China, which was an open city, meaning it did not require a visa to get in. Shanghai was an interesting city that was built on a swamp by the British in the 19th century when they needed a port in order to facilitate their opium trade. Shanghai experienced 3 waves of Jewish emigration. The first one in the middle of the 19th century when the Baghdadi Jews came to establish outposts for their trading empire. And names like the Kaduris and the Sassoons became very famous in Shanghai. They made a lot of money and they were big philanthropists. The second wave of Jewish immigration to Shanghai were the white Russians who escaped the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 through the early 1920s. And they established businesses, and also many poor people were there, and it was quite a rough life for many of them. The third wave of Jewish immigration were the Europeans, both from Eastern and Western Europe, who began to flock there after the Nazis took over. And from about 1935-37 through to the entry of America into the war on December 7th, 1941, approximately 20,000 Europeans came to Shanghai, which had a reputation of being a disease-ridden, crime-ridden hellhole in the East, but you could get in and escape. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the documentaries and writings of the period, is the people who went there had to put up with stiff opposition from their relatives who said, "Why are you going there? This will blow over." In all of the biographies that I read where this particular incident occurred, everybody who went to Shanghai was alive at the end of the war, and everybody who stayed wasn't. So here's a little bit of chronology to help set the scene for our family. The annexation of Austria and Germany took place on the 13th of March 1938. On May 29th, my father Walter and his brother Dr. Ernst Kisch were grabbed by the Gestapo and thrown into concentration camp. They were released in February of 1939, and both Walter and Ernst had to leave the country within a month and got on a boat to China. My mother and I were unable to follow them at the time, and so it was not until January of 1940 that my mother and her mother and I were able to get out of Vienna to take a boat from Genoa to Shanghai. So my father was there as of April 1939, and he'd set up a business, a shop, and my mother and I arrived in February of 1940. My father had established a retail store, and we lived for a number of years in the French concession until 1943, when the Japanese government issued an edict that all stateless, namely Jewish, residents had to move out of all the other parts of Shanghai into a very rundown area that had been badly bombed during the Japanese-Chinese War in the late 30s, called Hongqiu. And there we were for 2 years until the war ended in August 1945. In July of 1946, my parents and I left Shanghai, bound for Australia, where other members of the family, especially on my mother's side, had managed to get entry visas before the war. And when the war ended, they sponsored us as migrants. However, the transportation system was pretty chaotic, and so we stayed in Hong Kong for 5 months before we could get transportation to Australia, and we finally arrived in Melbourne at the end of November 1946. All right, here are some interesting documents to sort of explain where things were. Every Jewish person in Vienna had to have an identity card, which was stamped very prominently with a J, and also every Jew had to have a Jewish name added to their real name. So here you see my mother's identity card, and her name was Grete, but her name now was Sarah Grete Kisch. Here is my identity card. Since I was only 2 years old at the time, they didn't need a photograph, but if you look at the bottom of the identity card, you'll see that my name is Eric Israel Kisch. I had told you that my father and his brother had been incarcerated in concentration camps, and one of the things that my father gave me just the year before he died, and he was cleaning up his papers and affairs, was his release certificate from Buchenwald. It's dated the 2nd of February, but you can't read the pencil markings near the top. He said, "The bastards lied. We didn't get out until the 15th." It's an amazing document, and for anybody interested in history, just holding this in your hand is quite a shock. And again, if you look carefully at the document, you'll see it says Jude Walter Kisch. Here's a picture of my parents and I just before my father embarked for China. His head is closely cropped, which was the sign of, the concentration camp shaved head look, and the puffy face was malnutrition. My mother clearly is unhappy, and I'm a toddler, so what did I care? Here's a picture of my father, Walter Kisch, taken in Singapore, and he was quite a colorful character, and there he is posing in a sea captain's hat and has two-tone shoes and holding a cigarette in the time-honored European tradition, very different from the way Australians and Americans hold their cigarettes. What follows next are a series of photographs that I found in my father's papers. They were pictures that he took on arrival, and they reflect, I think, his amazement. Here he is, a very sophisticated Viennese, educated, cultured person, suddenly thrown into this extremely strange environment. And here are some of his impressions taken of street scenes. In this picture, you'll see a tall building in the background, and this was the Cathay Hotel, now called the Peace Hotel, and it was on the border of Hongqiu. Since Shanghai was under the Japanese occupation, you regularly had Japanese troops on the street patrolling, and there were checkpoints and barbed wire areas fenced off, which, again, my father was able to photograph. Shanghai weather was pretty terrible. It was incredibly hot and humid, impossibly so in summer, freezing cold in winter, and subject to torrential typhoons. Here are a series of pictures of one of them, and you can see the kind of flooding on the street made life pretty much impossible during those times. Let me add, of course, that the sanitation in Shanghai was not particularly great, so if you had 3 feet of water and raw sewage floating around, you can imagine how treacherous and dangerous that was for anybody's health. Now, one of the stories that my mother told was when she and her mother were waiting in Genoa for the boat to leave, they had absolutely no money. They got out of Vienna with practically nothing and were wondering what was going to happen. So they were staying at a hotel and then received a telegram that my mother said was from her uncle Pepe Deutsch, and it said, go and look up this particular senior bookkeeper and go and see him and tell him I sent you. So my mother said that with her last change, she got on a streetcar, went to this particular address early evening, knocked on the door and said, hi, I'm Grete Kisch. Pepe Deutsch is my uncle and he told me to come and see you. And the man grabbed her, put her in a room in the front, locked the door, got down on his knees and said, I love your uncle, I will help you. He took out his wallet, gave her all the money in it, and he said, and now you must leave and never tell anybody you were here because this could cost me my life. And my mother said it was on that money that she and my grandmother and I lived on for the next several weeks until we got to Shanghai. Now, I'd heard this story, but my mother wrote a very brief memoir, including some documents, including this particular telegram. And it's one of the things that is part of the story of the family, and here is, in a sense, a validation, an absolutely objective piece of information to verify the truth of this particular family history story. The ship we came to Shanghai on from Genoa was called the Conte Biancamanu, and it was a Lloyd Triestino liner that made 7 voyages between 1937 and 1940. And my mother had always said, you know, we were on the last boat to leave Genoa. And in one of the history books about the Jewish community in Shanghai, I found this particular picture, and you will see it says the 7 voyages of the Biancamanu ending in February 1940. So again, here is documentation for this. Here's another picture of people disembarking from the ship. And here is an American Express ticket that paid for our sea voyage to Shanghai. Here's the passenger list of the Conte Biancamanu on this particular voyage, and I have circled where my mother and I are on that list. And to sort of put the clincher in the argument in terms of dating, here is the dinner menu of the final dinner on the night that the Conte Biancamanu landed in Shanghai, and it is dated the 5th of February 1940. So here we have documentary proof that indeed we were amazingly on the last voyage of the Conte Biancamanu to Shanghai. Well, what was life like in Shanghai? First, of course, everybody had to have an identity card, and here is mine. This is a picture taken of me, I guess, at the age of about 3 or 4 with a crew cut, sort of brush cut, very European style. And here's my mother's identity card. And you can see that this was not a particularly good time for her. I had mentioned at the beginning that my father had set up a shop while we were living in the French concession, and it was called the Handbag, and it was on a corner of a very fashionable street. Here are some pictures of both the outside and the inside. The whole theme of the decor was to show a minimum number of items, and that if you didn't like what you saw, 1 or 2 at a time additionally would be presented to you. And compare this of going into a major store today and seeing 200-300 bags in a big jumble. Now let me take you to Hongqiu. Here's a map where I have highlighted a couple of things: the Kaduri School that I went to, and also the Ward Road Synagogue where I went to Talmud Torah. Today, this Ward Road Synagogue is known as Ohel Moshe, and it is the major Jewish museum in Shanghai, in Hongqiu, and has tours there regularly. This is what Hongqiu looked like when the Jews were sort of forced to move there. It had been pretty much bombed during the Sino-Japanese War in the late 30s and was quite a terrible place, but Jewish immigrant labor and effort managed to rebuild it into a little Vienna. Many of the penniless refugees came straight to Hongqiu and lived in things called Heime, or homes, supported by mostly American charities, as well as by some of the wealthy Anglo-Jews like the Kaduris and the Sassoons, who provided funds for this incredible onslaught of penniless, desperate European refugees. This is what one of the main thoroughfares in Hongqiu, Chuzan Road, a very commercial street, looked like before the Europeans got there. And this is what it looked like after they got there and rebuilt it. It was a very busy market street. There were all kinds of Viennese cafes and stores for people who had a few pennies to spend. People lived in Hongqiu in lanes. Our particular address was 323 Kongping Road, which I didn't know the exact address at the time I had put this presentation together, but I do remember that you entered from the street into an alley, and on either side were apartment buildings with stairs to the various floors. Nobody had any bathrooms in or toilets in the apartments or flats, and most of the cooking was done outside on little stoves fed by charcoal. One of the sad events that's also notable about Shanghai was a number of single men who escaped to Shanghai, who had nothing except a suitcase full of clothing and effects, were forced to sell them on the street, peddling these things to make pocket money for food, the shelter being provided by the Heime. Well, of course, as a kid, I had to go to school, and in Hongqiu, I went to school to what was known as the Kaduri School, or the Shanghai Jewish Youth School. This is a picture from one of the books about Shanghai, and it shows a class with a teacher, Mr. Gassenheimer, who was my teacher. Now, interestingly enough, when I showed this picture to a Jewish audience in Cleveland, one of the people said, "That's me, 4th from the left in the 2nd row," and that's my friend Peter Gray, who now lives in retirement in California. But it's not my class, this is, and it again shows Mr. Gassenheimer, and the red dot of the juvenile delinquent in the front row is me. I don't know what happened to any of the other members of the class, but I did hear about what happened to Mr. Gassenheimer, who came to America, changed his name to Gates, and became a rabbi of a Jewish community in Alameda County on the East Bay area of San Francisco. And Peter Gray sent me an article in the local Jewish news about his widow, whom I contacted and who knew nothing about his life in Shanghai. And those stories, I think, of people who left their past behind and never referred to it, is probably very common amongst survivors. The great event, tragic event of the Hongqiu Ghetto experience was on the 17th of July, 1945, literally a couple of weeks before the war in the Pacific ended. The war in Europe had already ended in May, but daily bombing raids continued. The Japanese cleverly had built a huge communications center in the middle of the ghetto, figuring that the Allies would not bomb it. Well, the Americans came, but only in daylight, and by and large managed to not injure anybody in the ghetto until this 17th of July, 1945, when one of the bombs went astray and hit the ghetto, causing amazing amounts of damage and a huge loss of life. Several dozen Europeans were killed and hundreds of Chinese. Now, the bomb blast went, according to the wind, away from the apartment building that we were living in, which was just a block away from this bomb. And that block was flattened. And our apartment block was not really affected. I had a friend who was playing on the balcony of his apartment in the same block that we lived in. And when the air raid siren went off, his mother grabbed him and ran down to the basement, which was our air raid shelter. And when the air raid was over and they came back to their apartment, that balcony was full of shrapnel. And Peter said if his mother hadn't grabbed him, he'd have been cut to pieces. Now, we didn't think anything about that. It was kind of normal life, and I'm sure many of you listening to this will say, wow, how could anybody survive this kind of terrible thing? Well, you do, and then you go on. The commandant of the Japanese occupation in Hongqiu was a Captain Goya, a short Japanese guy who really had it in for Europeans who were taller, and if they were called into his office for any reason, he would very often jump on his desk and slap the person around a bit. He was known as Goya, King of the Jews, and like all of the Japanese when the war ended, was in sort of abject humbleness afterwards, in direct contrast to the kind of arrogance that they showed while they were in charge. One of the documentary films about Shanghai interviewed a man who was a teenager and a young adult at the time, and he said that when the war ended, actually a few days before, they went into Goya's office and started to beat him up and were going to kill him. But he said, I couldn't in cold blood shoot this guy. And so they left. And a couple of days later, the atomic bomb dropped and the war ended. But it's a very interesting story, and I would certainly recommend this film, Port of Last Resort, from which I drew a video clip at the beginning. We leave for Hong Kong in July of 1946, and we leave on an American former troop ship called the USS General Gordon. We get to Hong Kong and we stay at the Peninsula Hotel, now a 5-star luxury hotel, but then a hotel that was turned into a dormitory for hundreds of refugees who had left Shanghai. This is a picture of a dormitory. We had the men's floor and the women's floor, and I think the children stayed with the women. Because we had 5 months in the place, we were able to travel around Hong Kong and go sightseeing, which was a really interesting place. And we had a number of friends there, one of whom had a camera, which was able to document our life in Hong Kong. Kol Nidre in 1946 at the Peninsula Hotel. There are some pictures here of people who will be very familiar to anybody from Melbourne who watched this. The cantor was Manny Antman, who became a prominent businessman in Melbourne, and next to him is his son Fred, who at the time this is being taped is alive and very prominent in Jewish community activities. The young man poking his face on the right of the picture is Gary Marish, who is now a retired and very prominent dentist in Sydney. The very tall man, looking directly at the camera, his last name is Michel, and he had a shop in Ackland Street, and between them, the guy with the glasses is my dad. So finally we leave Hong Kong to go to Australia, and we fly in a very convoluted route from Hong Kong to Singapore, various stops along the way until finally Sydney and Melbourne. In October 2000, my wife and I were on a tour of China to see the Three Gorges before they were submerged by the Great Dam, and we played hooky from the tour for a day to go and revisit Shanghai. We went for a bit of a walk around the French concession, but all the street names had changed, so we could not find the Rue de Maresca, which was the home for the first 3 years that we were in Shanghai. We hired a guide, a lovely young Chinese law student named Melody, who was not familiar at all with the territory, and so here is a picture of her asking for directions. Proof that my wife and I were in Shanghai in 2000, and here we are at Chuzan Road with our friends standing in front of Ohel Moshe. At the time, the only marker of the Jewish presence in addition to Ohel Moshe was this stone pedestal in a park nearby that in 3 languages talked about how the Chinese people had provided refuge. Since then, there have been a much more extended commemoration of the Jewish presence there, and I am told, I'm speaking to you in April of 2015, that recently there was completed a several meter long wall that holds the name of about 18,000 of the Jews who lived there, whose names are on record. I haven't seen it, but I'm very interested in going back and taking a look. I have been told that our family names are there. When we visited Ohel Moshe, I took a picture of the rooftops, and it seemed to me that Hongqiu had not changed in the least since we left in 1946. I have been told that since then there's been a lot of new construction and there's very little left of the original Hongqiu. And having said that, the national bird of Shanghai was the building crane, and apparently they finally started to peck at Hongqiu. Here is a Mr. Chen and our guide Melody in front of one of the houses in Hongqiu. Mr. Chen was born in an apartment that actually had been occupied by one of the Jewish refugees and was very keen and a docent at Ohel Moshe. Here we are at Chuzan Road in the year 2000, now completely Chinese except for some Western brand names. We looked for Kungping Road, which is now called Gongping Lu, and at the time I didn't have the exact address, but I knew we lived in the 300 block, and so here is one of the lanes. There were earlier pictures of lanes, but this is a more recent one in color. And again, all of the dwellings are on the side of this alley. I told you at the beginning of the talk that we didn't know where the money came from to basically spring my dad and his brother from concentration camp in order to get them out of the country. At the time, Buchenwald was a labor camp, but you could get out if you had proof that you had a passage paid out of the country to a country that would accept you. And the question then came, where did the money come from, since all assets by Jews had been confiscated? Well, when my stepmother died in early 2002, I found amongst her papers a carbon copy of a letter that my father had written in 1958 when he got his first reparations check from Austria. And it was addressed to a company in Amsterdam. And he writes in German that I cannot thank your Mr. Bormann enough to listen to the entreaties of a desperate father trying to get his two sons out of Nazi-occupied Vienna. And my grandfather had been export director of a major paper manufacturing company called the Neusiedler. And although he had retired by the time the Anschluss came, he obviously had business contacts throughout Europe and wrote. And this Mr. Bormann must have known what was going on and sent the money. And my father felt it was a debt of honor to repay this loan, which I'm sure Mr. Bormann never expected to have repaid. So there was the smoking gun, finally, that explained how my dad and his brother got out of Europe. Now, here are some things that you might be interested in following up on this talk. Probably the best introduction to Shanghai and the Jews there is this book by James Ross, a professor at the time at Northeastern University. And he gives a history of the Jewish migrations to Shanghai and interweaves the story of four families and their experiences there. The Shanghai Museum has since published books on the Jews of China with lots of photographs of the people there and of the places. And this, I think, is still readily available at the Shanghai Museum. And for anybody interested, is well worth the few dollars it costs to bring back. And that's the end of the journey for the moment. I hope, while I'm still alive, to go back again to Shanghai and see what transformations there were. And I encourage anybody that's got an interesting story to tell to dig into your family papers, validate your memories, and put it on the record for future generations. So I hope I haven't bored you to tears. Enjoy the rest of your visit.